Hi there. Sorry to be a bit late tonight, but welcome to you all. I was having a little bit of technical difficulty with my camera software, which doesn't seem to want to let me do the things I normally do with it, even though I have 2 months to run on my license. That's very unfriendly, certainly. Anyway, hi Dolores. Hi Evelina. Hi Kay, nice to see you. Not seeing too many of your comments yet. I'm not sure why that is. But, any case, so I continue to be very concerned with the problem of Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, the filibuster, and there's Democrats standing in the way of progress. Hi, Lana. Lana says, greetings all. I'm watching on my TV and don't say anything for a bit. Please don't think I have deserted you. Thank you. Kay says, hi, glad to see you. Susan Solis says, hi. Nice to see you, Susan. And Deborah Wilson says, hey, Joe. Hi, Deborah. How are you? I continue to be concerned with that particular problem. Anyway, and so in this particular video, I want to focus on that. I want to focus on what people can do to solve the problem of Joe Manchin, the filibuster, and the small minority of Democrats standing in the way of the various things we have to do to meet very serious crises that we now face. Kay says, was watching Daryl's House live. Great Allman Brothers band, cover band. That was fantastic. Evelina says, People's Party and others pushing for an end to the filibuster. Yes, it's one thing to push for the end of the filibuster as an issue, but it's another to focus on those people who are standing in the way, of an end to the filibuster. Anyway, I want to start off our discussion tonight by going to something else entirely, and then circling around and but coming back here. Specifically, I want to start off with the current crises, of all crises, the current crisis of all crises, which is, of course, still right at the moment, the COVID crisis. There was a particularly good piece I wanted to go over with you by William Rivers Pitt, which appeared a few days ago, and I'm now sharing that with you. It's called The Nightmare Anniversary Should Remind Us It Didn't Have to Be This Way. This is by William Rivers Pitt. It appeared in Truth Out. And he remarks, COVID-19 was already here a year ago today and already spreading across the United States with more than 1,000 confirmed cases and dozens of deaths on the books. Still, consensus has settled on today as a proper marker for the 1-year anniversary of the long grinding, lethal nightmare we have endured and continue to endure. 1 year ago today, the World Health Organization officially labeled crisis a pandemic. Most people I've spoken to don't remember that specifically. Today became, quote, shit got real day, unquote. For most of them, when it was announced that actor Tom Hanks and his wife, whose name, by the way, is Rita Wilson, had been diagnosed. Later in the evening, the NBA went up in flames, basically calling off the season just before tip-off of a Jazz Thunder game in Oklahoma City. The basketball fiasco coughed up its first COVID villain not named Donald Trump. 2 days before the season was suspended, Jazz center Rudy Gobert ran around a packed press room and touched every microphone with his bare hands, an act of witless defiance that endeared him to the same subset of the population that sacked the Capitol building the following January. It's a bit of an exaggeration to say or imply the whole building was sacked. I don't think it was quite the whole building. But anyway, 2 days later, Gobert was diagnosed with COVID, and his teammates, opponents, and everyone who went near those microphones suddenly found themselves in the valley of the shadow of death. Gobert's behavior and subsequent diagnosis were the prime impetus for curtailing the season. And all the other major sports leagues, college athletics as well, almost immediately followed suit. 1 year ago tonight, then President Trump gave a speech that forecast exactly how he planned to let 500,000 people die because he feared looking weak and culpable. He announced, quote, "The virus will not have a chance against us. Our future remains brighter than anyone can imagine," unquote. That speech set the tone for what would be his final year in office. His behavior was horrifying and not at all surprising in equal measure. He carried that tune to his last day in the building and beyond. Quote, "I needed a president to tell me about the availability of testing for the virus, about the deliberate actions taken to contain the spread, about social distancing and other preventive measures, about preparedness for a disruption that may last weeks," I wrote, after Trump's address a year ago. And quote again, "I needed to know. There was a steady hand on the wheel, if only for a few minutes. I needed to know the facts if I am to properly protect my people and by proxy my community. Of course, this president let me down. Donald Trump's barefaced unreliability is the single most reliable aspect of his existence," unquote. Thus began the silent spring, says William Rivers Pitt. Hospital fills to bursting with the desperately ill, and medical workers found themselves wearing garbage bags and used Lysol-dipped masks because nobody was in charge and everything was somebody else's fault. The schools emptied, and millions of children found themselves trapped at home like bugs in a bottle. Parents began to buckle under the strain of working and schooling from home. By April, business leaders and some Republican governors were pushing hard for a return to normal because capitalism cares. Not one fig for your well-being. You, me, we, all replaceable in the clockwork of profit and growth, quote unquote. Things loosened up over the summer, a false dawn belied by the fact that the U.S. led the world in infections per capita Thanksgiving and Christmas stoked the flames, and this past winter saw the worst days of this pandemic stack up like bodies in a cold storage truck. There seems little merit in cataloging my own personal damage after this year. I'm alive and uninfected, at least for now, which at times feels miraculous. At some point, my number will come up and I will get the vaccine. My daughter has shown me what resilience looks like, and I am grateful for that beyond measure. Perhaps I will get sick, and perhaps I will die, but not today, probably. Millions of people in hyper-affected communities of color cannot say the same. Nearly 30 million people in the U.S. were infected and survived over the last year. Now only God knows how many face what is being called, quote, long COVID, unquote, which is a debilitating post-infection barrage of brutal symptoms that simply will not abate. Once this is over, if it is ever over, those untold thousands of, quote, long haulers, unquote, will be forced to live with the damage in a country that has a grim knack for ignoring and underserving the disabled. Meanwhile, even those of us who did not fall ill are experiencing the impact of the past year. Although I have not experienced the work of it by far, my mind is not right. Specifically, I'm forgetting things I once knew by rote. I took my car to the car wash yesterday to scrape the last of winter off and forgot how to do it for a minute. I've run my car through the wash a dozen times since I got it. New Hampshire road salt eats cars. And it's always the same. Aim left front wheel into groove, pull up until told to stop, put car in neutral, and wait for the scrubbing octopus to attack as I am pulled through the process. Yesterday, I stared at the gear shift for a long moment after I grooved the wheel and put the car in park, thinking it was neutral. I had forgotten where neutral was on my shifter. The wash tried to pull my car into the water, but because it wasn't in neutral, my whole front axle was nearly torn off. I jolted and threw it into the proper gear while the wash attendant looked at me like I was some strangely ignorant species of bug. I hid my face as I was finally pulled into the maw. That kind of thing has been happening to me at increasing intervals lately, and I am not alone. Quote, I can't stop noticing all the things I'm forgetting, writes Ellen Cushing for The Atlantic. And quote again, sometimes I grasp at a word or a name. Sometimes I walk into the kitchen and find myself bewildered as to why I am there. At one point during the writing of this article, I absent-mindedly cleaned my glasses with nail polish remover. Other times, the forgetting feels like someone is taking a chisel to the bedrock of my brain, prying everything loose. Everywhere I turn, the fog of forgetting has crept in. Unquote. A scrap of Pearl Jam verse wafts through my head often these days. Quote, and to this day she's glided on, always home but so far away, like a word misplaced, unquote. I find it a fitting epitaph for 2020. A word misplaced. What a waste. Even with 3 different vaccines cascading with irregular and racially disparate availability into the population, even with that much of the U.S. finally taking seriously the necessity of wearing masks, And even as the winter gives way to spring, I am nowhere near feeling a sense of optimism for the future. All across the country, state governments that should know better are loosening COVID restrictions precisely when they should be holding fast. The variants are out there, and COVID is as cunning and ruthless as anything humanity has ever encountered. Quite simply, we as a nation are perfectly capable of screwing ourselves out of all this progress. Some experts say that at least another year must pass ensconced in these fearful doldrums before anything like, quote, normal, unquote, comes sniffing around again. Fear. That is what I will remember always, like a thrum below the sternum, like a flutter in the blood. Fear has been my dismal resting state this year. Fear for myself, my family, my friends, my country, and my planet. There is no escaping or assuaging it, because I could be sitting here infected right now and not know it. I feel like $100 and it doesn't matter a damn. It is impossible to rest, really rest, with this shadow on me. Fear and sorrow, a fathomless woe yet unspeakable. Someday perhaps I will find the words to explain it. I am not nearly there. There is still a vice around my heart. Sometimes I have to remind myself to breathe. It did not have to be this way. And the ones who made it this way have raked hundreds of millions of dollars off the people they duped into believing it isn't actually this way at all. I will never forget that. I will never forgive it. And I await a reckoning the way my little girl anticipates Christmas on the balls of her feet. 1 year later, with nearly 530,000 dead, it's more like 550,000 according to the Worldometer site, and almost 30 million infected. I recall what Trump said a year ago today, quote, "It will go away, just stay calm, be calm. It's really working out, and a lot of good things are going to happen," unquote. What a waste. I thought you really needed to hear that post from Walter Rivers Pitt. Brilliant post that reflects how many of us have been feeling near the anniversary of this being declared a pandemic. We have to keep this in mind when we talk about asserting our power. Next, I wanted to move us to a piece from Dave Dayen. As you know, another one of my favorites. The American Rescue Plan significant public a couple of days ago. There's a picture of Larry Summers, who doesn't think there are plenty of long-term investments in the American Rescue Plan. But Dave Dayen says, contra Larry Summers, there are. And he points out that just a moment of reflection is what we've all settled on as Pandemic Day, which was actually March 11th, marks the date of the official designation of a pandemic in the United States. or at least the day Tom Hanks got the virus and the NBA shut down because of Rudy Gobert's diagnosis. He points out that he started his unsanitized column the very next day, and that he's been doing a daily report ever since, every day for a year now. Now that we're on the downside of that crisis, I'm going to be wrapping this up soon. We're at day 51 of the first 100's schedule. So he changed the name of the column from unsanitized to first 100 when Joe Biden came into office. And now he's through day 51 of the first 100 days. And he says, thanks to everyone who's taken this journey alongside me to try to make sense of this enveloping crisis and how we've reacted. There's still more to be done, so let's get to it. And he points out the 1.9 trillion American the rescue plan will be signed, which of course it has been since then. And he points out Congress had to add $60 billion in tax measures because it had to adhere to the preset price tag, which it had to preset because of the reconciliation bill. Passing a reconciliation bill requires presetting a price tag, and they weren't clever enough to preset it at something greater than what they were likely to need. So they ran over the 1.9 trillion by close to 2 trillion, and that meant that they had to quickly add 60 billion in tax measures to the reconciliation bill. 60 billion in tax measures, I should say, to the reconciliation bill in order to get it within the net of 1.9 trillion that they were able to deficit spend. Okay, at least at the time. Of course, in reconciliation, over 10 years, there can't be deficit spending, but in the initial year, there can be. Anyway, one of the big complaints with the bill from the likes of Larry Summers was particularly incoherent. He didn't mind a lot of spending. It's just that it should be channeled to public investment, not just giving away a bunch of money. Dave says this is critically wrong on a number of levels, but the biggest is that the ARP does in fact bring lasting public investment in certain areas. And considering that it's so big, that makes it a huge one-year investment bill as well. He says much of these investments prevent deterioration, but a smaller hole to drag out of in the future certainly helps matters. And some will create pockets of durability, things that will be remembered as part of the ARP. That's especially true if key investments are eventually made permanent. He points to the section-by-section summary of the bill that's at democrats.senate.gov and says that's already yielded a number of surprises popping up in the political media, but these haven't gone far enough. Let's start with the health infrastructure investment. There's a section on providing medical supplies and personnel for rural healthcare providers, something that will be difficult to dislodge once the pandemic is over. There's $7.6 billion for state and local health department workers, and another $7.6 billion for community health centers, which provide basic care to poor communities. By the way, that's a favorite of Bernie Sanders, community health care centers. For instance, Bernie Sanders got $11 billion for community health centers in the Affordable Care Act over 5 years, and it made a significant difference. Now there's $7.6 billion in 1 year for the community health centers. That is likely to make a significant difference. Dave goes on. Then there's the school funding, $128 billion dedicated to K through 12. The formula under which it will be given will deliver more to the poorest schools, up to $8,000 per student in low-income districts like Cleveland. In the words of Nina Turner, hello, somebody. Outside of 20% set aside to address lost learning in the pandemic year. That funding has a pretty wide discretion, meaning it can be used to make long-term investments in school, like improving ventilation, which can serve as both pandemic preparedness and better learning environments. These have proven to make a difference in the classroom. The $39 billion in child care grants can rebuild care infrastructure, which our special report last year showed is desperately needed. Thought about as a one-year investment, these child care grants are absolutely enormous. There's also a $7 million emergency connectivity fund for remote learning, which comes too late but can help to provide lasting broadband infrastructure. The $200 million for libraries is also a broadband infrastructure investment for those who have no other options for connectivity. There's also a $30.5 billion, there is $30.5 billion for public transit, which will go towards arresting the sector-wide crisis from low pandemic ridership, which easily could have spiraled into permanent cutbacks. This will sustain transit budgets until 2023 in some areas. He says, I'm not a huge fan of the $2 billion snuck in for IT and cybersecurity, but it will modernize federal agency systems. There's $100 million for better air quality monitoring, which will last. This is all on top of the $350 billion investment in state and local governments, which, thanks to a last-minute change, can go towards sent. While being from Los Angeles and seeing up close our pandemic-driven crisis in public budgeting makes me happiest as this money will avert those tough choices. See Janet Yellen on how we learned from the financial crisis not to offset federal stimulus with state and local austerity, and then he links to a statement by Janet Yellen. There's no doubt some of this money will pour into lasting investments and upgrades in key systems. Similarly, the $31 billion for tribal governments, the largest investment in those communities in some time, will likely include lasting infrastructure. Some of it is earmarked for housing. Finally, there's a term I cannot stand, investment in human capital. But when you have legislation that for 1 year would reduce poverty from 13.7% to 8.7% and cut child poverty by more than half, you are freeing people from many day-to-day stresses and putting them in position to succeed. When you have airline workers being told to tear up their furlough notices and an economic recovery time that's twice as fast as previously projected, and economic growth at the fastest level since the Korean War, that likely means better bargaining power for labor and more opportunity for rising wages. These investments allow people to contribute and succeed. It's no wonder Republicans who voted against the ARP en masse are already trying to take credit for it. Not all of these above-mentioned items will leave permanent investments in place. In fact, they'll need to be fought for to ensure this isn't just a blip. This is the beginning of a second war on poverty, not the end. What Democrats do next, and whether this bill sets up for a midterm victory, will tell that story. But there could be as much as 100 billion in investments here, if not 200 billion. As a one-year boost at the most optimistic level, that's equivalent to a decade-long $2 trillion infrastructure package proposed by a guy named Larry Summers. So, a lot of interesting things in that particular column by way of showing that this bill does have a lot of investment aspects to it, as well as the relief aspects to it, and that those investment aspects are extremely significant. But how do we continue this second war on poverty if we're going to actually have that second war on poverty? If it is really going to be that, how is it going to actually become that? So, next, I wanted to bring us to something else that will be very significant in just a few days. And depending on the fate of this, it will help to determine how far this second war on poverty, is going to go. And now you're looking at an article from Common Dreams, published today. It's by Jake Johnson. The title is Jayapal Badingle, that's Debbie Dingle, of course, to unveil Medicare for All Act exactly 1 year after first COVID cases confirmed in every state. And a little picture of somebody standing with a sign by a car. Total coverage for all with hashtag single payer. That's a demonstrator holding a Medicare for All sign on January 1st, 2021 in Pasadena, California. In the middle of a deadly pandemic that's further exposed the absurdity and immorality of tying health insurance to employment. Democratic reps, Jayapal and Debbie Dingle, are planning to introduce the Medicare for All Act of 2021 this coming Wednesday, March 17th. Exactly 1 year after the first coronavirus cases were confirmed in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. This bill's official introduction, set for March 17th, quote, is an attempt to link the cause of universal care with the devastation wrought by the pandemic. This was reported actually by Politico in this way. I thought it was an attempt to link the cause of universal health care to St. Patrick's Day. But I'm happy to be corrected that it was something more significant than that. No insult to St. Patrick's Day intended. Mark your calendars, tweeted Jayapal, a longtime single-payer advocate who was the lead House sponsor of the Medicare for All Act of 2019, which experts at the time characterized as the gold standard for universal health care legislation. Yes, they did. Physicians for a National Health Program characterized it as the gold standard for universal health care legislation. That bill was H.R. 1384, if you recall. The bill proposed a 2-year transition to a Medicare for All system that would provide comprehensive health care to everyone in the United States for free at the point of service. Since the coronavirus crisis began last year, millions of people across the U.S. have been thrown off their employer-provided health insurance, the nation's most common form of coverage, due to pandemic-induced mass layoffs that have persisted in recent weeks. Last week, an additional 1.2 million people in the United States filed for unemployment insurance. This past year makes it clear, this is a quote, why we must pass Medicare for all, unquote, said Nina Turner, a Democratic congressional candidate in Ohio's 11th district, which of course is Cleveland, or a good part of Cleveland anyway. Jayapal tweeted, mark your calendars, and they announced they're going to unveil the bill on March 17th, and they connected it to the anniversary of the recognition that all states had experienced at least one COVID-19 case. While progressives such as Jayapal and Bernie Sanders have called for an expansion of Medicare to cover the newly uninsured and everyone else for the duration of the pandemic, congressional Democrats went a different route in the newly passed American Rescue Plan, which significantly expands eligibility for Affordable Care Act subsidies and fully covers private premiums under COBRA, an expensive program that lets laid-off workers stay on their employer-provided insurance, which of course would be nowhere near as good as Medicare for all. Speaking to the New York Times last week, Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, made clear her disagreement with that approach. Quote, I don't think this was the most efficient way to do this. She said of the ARP's expansion of private insurance, the nearly $2 trillion relief package, which President Joe Biden, a Medicare for All opponent, signed into law on Thursday, also includes funding to incentivize states to expand Medicaid, an offer that's unlikely to be taken up by Republican governors. Like, when are they going to do things that are likely to benefit their constituents? And why do they still remain the Republican governors when they don't do anything for their constituents? Social Security Works, a progressive advocacy organization, tweeted, in response to the coming introduction of the latest iteration of the Medicare for All Act, that, quote, tying healthcare to employment was ridiculous and cruel before the pandemic, unquote. And quote again, and now with millions more Americans unemployed, it's horrific. We must guarantee healthcare as a human right, not as an employment benefit. We need Medicare for all, unquote. If we're going to win that war on poverty, the war, or I should say the battle for it, the sub-war for it, is greatly important for winning the war on poverty as well. So, next, we come to something else that is very important in relation to our asserting our power. This is a piece that doesn't appear on the surface to have anything directly to do with the second war on poverty, or even perhaps to the war on COVID here in the United States. This one is about what the U.S. owes Iran, and it was written by Ryan Cooper of The Week on March 12th. And Ryan says, I'm sharing it with you now, of course, when campaigning in 2020, Joe Biden promised he'd make every effort to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. But some 50 days into his presidency, progress has stalled and the deal is reportedly on the verge of collapse. Now that he's president, Biden should grant Iran broad sanctions relief immediately, both as a show of good faith and for the sake of humanitarian relief as part of negotiations to rejoin the deal. The United States has inflicted terrific damage on the Iranian government and the Iranian people, which badly exacerbated the carnage of the coronavirus pandemic there. The United States owes it to them. The diplomatic sticking point here is that Biden is not insisting on Iran fully recommitting to the deal before any sanctions are lifted, while Iran is asking for the opposite. As Biden wrote in a CNN op-ed in September last year, quote, "If Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, the United States would rejoin the agreement as a starting point for follow-on negotiations," unquote. By contrast, Iranian President Rouhani said Wednesday, quote, "The United States was first in breaking with the agreement, and it should be the first to return to it." And just as Ryan seems to agree, I have to say I completely agree with this too. We broke the agreement. It's up to us to be first to return to it. How can any fair-minded person conclude anything else? It is only fair. It is a good faith gesture. Why is this important to meeting our various crises? Why is it important to the second war on poverty? Because can you think of anything that is more likely to derail us from making progress on the climate crisis, from making progress when it comes to economic justice, from making progress when it comes to developing our democracy, than another new war with Iran in the Middle East? What has historically diverted us from new efforts at social justice in our country? What torpedoed progress towards social and economic justice in the 1960s? It was the war in Vietnam. Do we need a war of similar size with the Iranians now? Or a nuclear exchange with the Iranians now? What's that going to do to the climate emergency? Ryan Cooper says, any case for which of these two positions is correct must depend on one's view of diplomatic history and the broader strategic context. On the first point, it is absolutely inarguable that the United States has been badly in the wrong. Iran joined the nuclear deal in good faith and was living up to its end of the bargain when President Trump abruptly betrayed that trust in 2018. Apparently because of vindictive hatred of everything President Obama did and the encouragement of various deranged warmongers. Yes, he had a lot of various deranged warmongers in his administration. Trump proceeded to assassinate Iranian leader Qasem Soleimani, who was roughly akin to being both Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on Iraqi soil, no less. That infuriated both Iranian and Iraqi leaders and sparked a cycle of tit-for-tat violence that continues to this day. when Trump reimposed sanctions on Iran and basically wrecked its economy. Inflation spiked, and severe shortages of numerous goods quickly developed, especially medical supplies. This terribly worsened the coronavirus pandemic there, as hospitals struggled to treat COVID-19 patients without proper protective gear or vital equipment. Certainly, thousands have died as a direct result of American acts. Thousands of Iranians died because of the actions we took. Moreover, Iran has a lot of historical reasons to distrust America. In 1988, U.S. forces shot down an Iranian airliner, killed 290 people. That's not something many of us will remember. The U.S. supported Iraq with money, training, and diplomats and diplomatic cover when it invaded Iran in 1980, leading to 8 years of gruesome trench warfare that eventually killed somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million Iranians, not to mention hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who also died in that war. And of course, the CIA backed the coup in 1953 against the democratic government of Iran, after which its people endured 20 years of brutal dictatorship under the Shah. We all knew here that dictatorship was brutal. They had a secret police that was notorious, absolutely notorious. Finally, on the question of the strategic context, the plain fact is that Iran barely matters to serious U.S. interests, no matter how you define them. It's a medium-sized, medium-income country halfway around the planet. It produces roughly a quarter as much oil as America itself. It has shown no inclination to strike at U.S. forces, except those that are right on its doorstep for no good reason, shooting at its top officials also for no good reason. Just imagine how Americans might feel if Iran had massive military outposts in Canada and Mexico all across the length of those two borders, was strangling our economy with sanctions, and occasionally blew up members of Biden's cabinet. In short, there is every reason on earth to cut Iran some slack. We broke its promise. As Biden himself wrote, we broke our promise. As Biden himself wrote, Trump, quote, recklessly tossed away a policy that was working to keep America safe, unquote. And so America should demonstrate some good faith. It's literally the least we could do, and contrary to arguments from bloodthirsty imperialist warmongers, doing so would actually help the U.S. by reducing the likelihood of getting bogged down in another unwinnable war 7,000 miles away. We think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were tough. Wait until we experience a war in Iran, which is 2.5 times the size of Iraq. And if I'm not mistaken, well, probably twice the population, of Afghanistan. It's not hard to see why the Biden administration is hesitating here. The reason is the imperialist DC blob. That is the military-industrial complex that has been hell-bent on war with Iran for years, and lobbying efforts of Israel and Saudi Arabia. Those forces are very influential in Congress, which is why senators grilled Wendy Sherman, Biden's nominee for Deputy Secretary of State, about her role as the chief negotiator for the nuclear deal during her recent confirmation hearing. Biden himself has long been implicated in this dynamic. Biden's recent decision to let Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman skate on assassinating Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi illuminates this perfectly. His op-ed on Iran is full of stern language about the, quote, challenges the regime in Iran poses to America's security interests, unquote. But with Saudi Arabia, we have an ally, quote unquote, that is objectively harmful to the United States interests. Even their oil is a massive net negative because of climate change, up to and including ordering the brutal murder of a prominent legal U.S. resident for criticizing bin Salman's repressive dictatorship. Yet because bin Salman has spread hundreds of millions of dollars in legal bribes around D.C., and because a great many American elites are preposterously credulous and or corrupt, he gets away with it. All this is a test case for Biden's declared intention to chart a new course in foreign policy. For that to happen, he will sooner or later have to stand up to the imperial war machine and the corrupt hired guns of foreign countries that want to treat the U.S. military as their own personal plaything. If he won't do that, his record on foreign policy will look basically similar to Donald Trump's. And also, if he gets involved in a new war inside of the Middle East, likely progress on the domestic crises we have will take a very, very important shot right in the midsection. A very, very heavy blow to the prospects of real change as long as a war with Iran goes on. So, what do we have to do? We have to assert our power, the power of the people. Here's a piece from Paul Street entitled, "Unless the Power of the People Asserts Itself." This is from Counterpunch, dated March 12th. And there's a photograph by Nathaniel St. Clair. No caption on the photograph, so we don't know where or what it is, but it looks like a concert for the people, or an event for the people in any case. Perhaps it's from the Occupy movement. In any case, what Street points out is that the COVID-19 pandemic and recession and the political realignment in Washington after the defeat of the malignant fascist Trump and the two former Republican senators in Georgia have opened the door for some welcome federal action. And he talks about the improvements in the new bill, the newly serious and aggressive federal response to the virus, and the passage of a relief bill that promises to significantly reduce poverty and economic insecurity in the coming months, with a combination of food assistance, rental and mortgage aid, expanded tax credits, increased healthcare subsidies, and more. The measure will cut U.S. poverty by 1/3 and child poverty by half. So he echoes those claims being made by others. Left, center, or right, you have to be a serious shithead to be opposed to Biden's $1.9 trillion age bill, which is backed by 70% of the U.S. Populace. It takes no small cognitive stubbornness these days to retain the time-worn, foolish refrain that there's, quote, no difference, unquote, between the two dominant political parties in the U.S. Look at the lockstep partisan breakdown of the congressional votes on the relief bill, accompanied by sickening Republic-fascist screeching about how elementarily decent government protections raise the specter of, quote, communist tyranny, unquote. It is far too soon to announce the dawning of a new welfare state in progressive age in America. However, Democrats' stimulus package, welcome though it may be, is an emergency measure that offers no fundamental or permanent change to the institutional structure, of American government. Where's the call to smash the exorbitant costs of the U.S. for-profit healthcare system and make quality healthcare a human right with single-payer insurance? Well, one answer to that question is that one call to do that is coming next Wednesday on March the 17th, when the latest Medicare for All bill will be introduced. But Paul Street continues. The accelerated vaccine rollout is badly plagued by savage inequalities of race and class, as well as by the anti-science madness of red state governors and legislators. With Biden announcing that the U.S. imperial machine will stay set on kill by attacking Syria, the Pentagon system continues to function as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described it in 1967. Jesus, folks, that's already 54 years ago. Quote, a demonic suction tube drawing men and skills and money, unquote, away from the meeting of human needs to feed the military-industrial war machine. Note three critical, elementary progressive things that have been unceremoniously kicked to the curb at the dawning of the Biden revolution. Should have put quotes around the Biden revolution, scare quotes. First bullet point, forgiving more than a tiny share of the giant and outrageous college student debt load that hangs like a bad nightmare over the heads of 10 millions of young and even middle-aged adults, turning them into neo-sharecroppers. Well, the brother of a friend of mine must by now be somewhere approaching 60. Maybe even approaching 65, and still crippled by student debt. Biden could wipe out an ocean of debt peonage with a single executive action, but has already betrayed one of his campaign pledges by announcing his unwillingness to forgive more than a pittance. Second bullet point. Raising the federal minimum wage to the elementarily decent is still woefully inadequate level of $15 an hour, which translates, assuming full-time work for 50 weeks, to $30,000 per year. But of course, people usually get 2 weeks vacation, so it's more like $31,200 per year. Less than a quarter of the cost of a basic minimum family budget for 2 parents and 2 children in Queens. In other words, he's saying that if the 2 parents work, it would still only be 1/2 the cost of a basic minimum family budget for 2 parents and 2 children in Queens. Queens, by the way, is Ocasio-Cortez's district. He is saying that a basic budget for two parents there is $120,000 per year, and I can well believe it. Queens is a very, very high cost of living area. That's why we need not just a minimum wage, but a minimum wage that's adjusted for the cost of living in all the different areas of the United States. It should maybe start at $24 an hour and then be cost adjusted all across the United States. Biden and the Democrats used the reactionary ruling of the arcane, quote, Senate parliamentarian, unquote, to justify not honoring the fight for 15 in the COVID relief bill. They could have overruled or fired the, quote, parliamentarian, unquote, if they had been serious about $15 an hour. They didn't have to explicitly overrule the parliamentarian or fire the parliamentarian. All they had to do was ignore the advice of the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is just an advisor. No overruling, quote unquote, is necessary. All you got to do is go about your business. Pass the damn bill. That's all they had to do. Just ignore the parliamentarian. You got an advisor. You don't overrule the advisor. The advisor is giving you advice. You're free to take it or not, right? Bullet point 3, passing the Protect the Right to Organize PRO Act. The PRO Act would be the most pro-labor legislation enacted by the federal government in 86 years. It would support workers' rights to strike for better wages and working conditions, strengthen protections for fair union certification elections, and allow the National Labor Relations Board to fine bosses for violating workers' rights. It would expand the definition of an employee by permitting independent contractors to join unions. It would overturn right-wing right-to-work laws, quote unquote, by letting union contracts require dues to be paid by all employees represented by collective bargaining agreements. The PRO Act would re-legalize union organizing and expand the labor movement, whose stunning decline over the last half century is one of the most neglected but important factors behind the deadly rightward drift of American society and politics. And Wall Street says the United States redistributed income downwards and granted much of its working populace a decent standard of living for roughly two decades after World War II, thanks in part to the New Deal's legal authorization and empowerment of union organizing and collective bargaining, reversed by decades of top-down union busting since the 1970s, really more like since the very last part of the 1970s. The PRO Act was recently passed by the House on an almost 100% party line basis. More evidence against the, quote, no difference, unquote, but myth, but is currently dead in the water in the Senate, thanks to opposition from Republicans, the business class. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says the PRO Act would, quote, destabilize America's workplaces and impose a long list of dangerous changes to labor law, unquote. And at least two reptilian corporate Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema, of Arizona, and maybe more than two reptilian corporate Democrats, maybe as many as 8 reptilian corporate Democrats, but at least 2 of the 8 are pretty much under the direct control of Joe Biden, and another 2 are certainly under the fair control of Joe Biden, and yet another 2 Joe Biden has strong influence with. So maybe there are 2 reptilian ones and 6 midway reptilian ones. If Biden was serious about his pledge to be the most pro-union president you've ever seen, he'd use his bully pulpit to put the squeeze on Manchin and Sinema, says Street. Call workers into the streets and public squares and demand the Democratic Senate abolish its reactionary filibuster rule. A real deal progressive president would call for a constitutional amendment to end the absurd overrepresentation of the nation's most reactionary rural and white states in the U.S. Senate. Liberal, urbanized, and multicultural California and right-wing white and rural Wyoming both have 2 representatives, even though the former state is home to nearly 40 million and the latter one houses just over 500,000 people. That is really just an astounding fact. It really is. In other words, the representation of those in Wyoming is 80 times more powerful than the representation which is given to the people of California per person. Per person. Okay, a person in Wyoming has 80 times the power. Amazing. Some democracy. At the very least, such a person would move to overcome the Republic-fascists' absurd overrepresentation by advancing statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. He'd also act to expand the Supreme Court, home to a right-wing supermajority absurdly far to the starboard side of the citizenry. And by the way, until the Supreme Court was expanded so it was no longer home to a right-wing supermajority absurdly far to the starboard side, to the starboard side of the citizenry. In the meantime, he'd prevent the Supreme Court from having the power to judicially review any legislation on campaign financing, and maybe any legislation at all, which of course it's within the power of the Congress to do by denying jurisdiction to the Supreme Court by using Article 3, Section 2, the exceptions clause of the Constitution. Going on with Paul Street. Then he or she and their allies would initiate challenges to the Buckley-Valeo 1976 and Citizens United decisions, which combine to grant practically unlimited campaign finance power over U.S. politics to the wealthy few. Yes, and that's where the exceptions clause of the Constitution would come in. Basically repeal the Buckley-Valeo decision and the CU decisions and prevent the Supreme Court from having any power to review the legislation that repeals those particular decisions. But don't leave it up to Joe Biden, says Paul Street, who promised elite Manhattan donors in 2019 that, quote, nothing would fundamentally change, unquote, in the distribution of wealth and power when he became the president, demonstrating, marching, monkey wrenching, bottlenecking, organizing, street preaching, teaching in, pot and pan banging, striking and demanding in the streets, workplaces, public squares, fields, parks, mills, mines, offices, schools, town halls, and factories is the only way to win elementarily decent things like student debt, abolition, having a minimum wage, that's a humane minimum wage, the right to organize effective unions, seriously progressive taxation, single payer, and then beyond that, a green-red New Deal, the tear down of the permanent war machine and workers' control. Let us never forget the sage wisdom of Howard Zinn, who wrote the following in a 2008 essay entitled Election Madness, quote unquote. Quote, yes, there are candidates who are somewhat better than ours. And at certain times of national crisis, the 30s, for instance, or right now, or even a slight difference between the two parties may be a matter of life and death. I'm talking about a sense of proportion that gets lost in the election madness. Would I support one candidate against another? Yes, for 2 minutes, the amount of time it takes to pull the lever down in the voting booth. But before and after those 2 minutes, our time, our energy should be spent in educating, agitating, organizing our fellow citizens in the workplace, in the neighborhood, in the schools. Our objective should be to build painstakingly, patiently, but energetically a movement that when it reaches a certain critical mass would shake whoever is in the White House, in Congress, into changing national policy on matters of war and social justice. Let's remember that even when there is a better candidate, yes, better Roosevelt than Hoover, better anyone than George Bush, that difference will not mean anything unless the power of the people asserts itself in ways that the occupant of the White House will find it dangerous to ignore, unquote. I go beyond Zinn. We need to do more than, quote, shake whoever is in the White House, unquote. We need to undertake what Dr. King called, quote, the real issue to be faced, unquote. Quote again, the radical reconstruction of society, unquote. Beyond capitalism and its evil twin, imperialism. And we're running out of time for, quote, patient, unquote, movement building in a time of capitalogenic ecocide. But that aside, please appreciate Zinn's basic point. Hoping for your masters to give you nice things after voting for one of their candidates won't get the goods. It's about more who then is sitting in the White House. It's about who's sitting in the streets. And it is about that, but it's also about who is sitting in the Senate, stopping action in the Senate through the power of the filibuster, and who is refusing to do anything about that power, even when it comes to passing H.R. 1, H.R. 4, statehood for Puerto Rico, statehood for D.C., Medicare for all, the Green New Deal bill, refusing even to start the process of reconciliation with respect to the infrastructure green bill that Biden says he wants to pass but through reconciliation, and saying, well, we can't start that off with reconciliation. What we have to do instead is to first see whether the Republicans would be willing to collaborate in a bipartisan manner. That's what Joe Manchin, is saying. What we have to do, of course, is do all the things Street suggests, but we also have to focus. We have to focus on Manchin and Sinema and on anyone who seems likely to go along with them in supporting continuous campaigns in their states, continuous campaigns against them, until they announce their support for getting rid of the filibuster immediately, using the nuclear option to get rid of the filibuster immediately. Kyrsten Sinema, in particular, standing against the minimum wage, refusing to pass a minimum wage against her constituents, and the same for Joe Manchin, and refusing to do this in the context of a reconciliation bill. So the only way it can be passed is through regular order, and then opposing the filibuster, opposing getting rid of the filibuster, so there can be no regular order, saying we need to do it by regular order, and then saying to us, catch-22, can't do it by regular order because there's the filibuster, and we support the filibuster because we want to facilitate debate in the Senate, and the filibuster brings debate. The filibuster has not brought debate in years and years and years. All it's brought is paralysis and failure to act, and crisis after crisis after crisis that never gets met, that we never solve, because we've got one party totally dedicated to the rich and the wealthy and the donors, okay, and paralysis, and we've got a few people in the other party, maybe more than a few people in the other party, who will not legislate for the people, will directly oppose all of these things, and will say we need regular order to do these things, and then say, catch-22, you can't do it by regular order because the filibuster is here when there's regular order, and we won't get rid of the filibuster. You got to hit them in their states, but not only on minimum wage, because even if they announced that they were now for a minimum wage, all they do would be let the Republicans filibuster it. So the minimum wage still couldn't get the votes it needs. But it's not simply about the minimum wage bill. It's about H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 and the statehood bills and racial justice bills and criminal justice reform bills. And it's about bills, Green New Deal bills. I know Biden doesn't want to call them Green New Deal bills, but Biden's infrastructure bill would have a lot of green stuff in it. And we can't do that. We cannot do that. We cannot do that as long as we have the filibuster. We have to focus on campaigns in the states of Sinema and Joe Manchin until their names are mud in their states. Joe Manchin is either going to retire in 2024 or he's going to be running against a Republican, Jim Justice, who's going to run to the left of Joe Manchin. He's already running to the left of Joe Manchin as the governor of that state. He's already critiquing Joe Manchin from the left. And the idiot doesn't have sense enough to move over. How can you let a Republican Trumpist get to the left of you? What kind of Democrat are you then? And of course, you idiots, you can't go over to the Republican Party because they only want Trumpists over there in West Virginia and in Arizona. So you guys are going to be done for in 2024 if you don't run as Democrats. And you won't be able to run as Democrats unless you abandon the filibuster and you abandon opposition to the minimum wage and you abandon opposition to H.R. 1, H.R. 4, H.R. 51, and H.R. 52, and the other bills as well. You got to start acting like Democrats used to act. That's what's got to happen. Okay, your comments. Kay says they need to get rid of that. And Lana says, hi, Susan. Kay says, share. Jim Bird said, we really think that the establishment would get rid of one of their tools to withhold stuff from the people. Filibuster, political parties, electoral college, the veto committees. Terry Burke says, made it. Tally ho, about to share and stuff. Great, Terry, great. Evelina says, not this establishment. Others are far more receptive. Susan Soleil says, hi. Lana Catherine Tokarska says, thanks, Terry Burke. Terry, for the invite. Terry says, Republican senators are trying to arm twist by Republican governors not to accept relief money. I think Bashir is going for refusing it. No, Bashir is a Democrat. He's not a Republican. He's not going to refuse it, Terry. No way. Terry says YVW. What is YVW, Terry? Steve Day smiles. Evelina says, read in Canadian media about one person infected who was studied and showed how the virus the virus mutated at least 3 times in 100 days. Boy, that's amazing. Lana says, Trump's handling of COVID got Biden elected. Otherwise, I am pretty sure Biden would have lost. Yeah, me too. Not only his handling of COVID, wasn't just his handling of COVID. I think he would have won if he had put himself out there heavily in favor of $2,000 checks back last September and not allowed the Republicans to confirm Amy Coney Barrett until they went for the $2,000 checks. If those checks had come in October for $2,000 with Trump's name on them, I'm pretty sure Biden would have lost. I am, in spite of COVID. Deborah said, nice reading of that succinct article. Thank you, Deborah. Lana says, oh no, not Larry again. L. Stephen Day says, thank you too. L. Stephen Day said, tax offset. Yeah, they had to put a tax offset into the bill. Which makes me wonder, since they had a tax offset in the bill, does that mean that they can't do a second tax bill by using reconciliation? I don't know. I'm not sure. See, this was now a combined bill. It was both a spending bill and a tax bill. Does that use up their one shot at a tax bill? I'm not sure. That might have to get a ruling of the parliamentarian again. Kay says, tried to get an appointment to get the J&J vaccine today. Shake my head. Ohio is doing a piss poor job on vaccines, at least here in the Canton Stark County area. Terry says, and thank you and Catherine for coming. Appreciate it. Susan Soleil says, if only they have included a clause to keep creditors from getting their hands on the $1,400. That's another point. They could not do that because it was a reconciliation bill. That would not have fit in a reconciliation bill. That's why it was not included. It was included in the $600 stimulus bill at the end of December because that was not a reconciliation bill. And it was included in the first bill as well because that was not a reconciliation bill. Actually, they failed to put it in the first bill anyway because they failed to think about it. But they quickly passed a bill to heal the breach because the Democrats were interested in doing that, and they didn't oppose the Republicans who also wanted to do it at their time. So people were protected from the creditors seizing their stuff. But in this bill, people are not protected from the creditors seizing their stuff. And it's unlikely the Republicans will go along with the Democrats. So again, the filibuster may block the passage of a clean bill just to prevent the creditors from getting their hands on the $1,400. And by the way, the administration jumped on getting the money out immediately, and reportedly some of the direct deposits are going out right now as we speak. In fact, someone in my building got an email today, or I'm sorry, I think he actually a regular mail today from the Treasury Department telling him that very shortly he was going to find a direct deposit in his account from the Treasury Department of the $1,400 stimulus payment. So that was today. It was only signed on Thursday. So the Biden administration was primed to immediately act the minute the bill was signed by the president. And the IRS has been immediately acting on that. So a real quick bill is needed to stop the creditors from getting their hands on the $1,400. I don't know if that's going to happen. And why didn't it happen? Because of the filibuster. Because they had to do a reconciliation bill. Why do they have to do a reconciliation bill? Because the filibuster exists. Because that's the way of getting around the filibuster. And under a reconciliation bill, they couldn't stop the creditors from getting their hands on the $1,400. I'm telling you, the whole impediment to progress here for dozens and dozens and dozens of things always traced back to the filibuster. K. Our Revolution Ohio did a rally today in support of the Amazon workers in Alabama trying to get a union, and Nina was there. Great. Absolutely great. I'm sure people are going to be rallying all over the country, and that's important. It's very, very important. But people have to focus an inordinate amount of attention on rallying against Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Really, that is so overwhelmingly important to get them into line. Biden will not get them into line unless we make him do it. And the only way we can make him do it is when he sees a material threat to their reelection. He doesn't want threats to Democratic senators, even though he himself put Warnock in danger in Georgia in 2022 by following the reconciliation strategy for the relief bill, instead of going in immediately with a checks and shots strategy that might have produced the checks after a week. If he had followed a strategy where he did checks and shots and getting rid of the filibuster that first week, he could have had these checks out the second week he was in office. They're only late because he decided to go with reconciliation. Alana says, I agree, Susan. I work for a big bank, and I think that whole thing should be outlawed. Susan says, I think we need a general strike. Indeed we do, Susan. Indeed we do. And Alana says, are you familiar with Jeff Ginter? He's trying to organize a general strike. And so is Arakel Blas, who, if you recall, we interviewed months back on the subject of a general strike. Steve Day says, Jayapal Dingle. Dingle is Dingell. And Stephen Day says, hashtag single payer. And Susan Soleil says, yes, I just watched our PMMT Monday's video with him. He is pissed. I didn't know he was organizing a general strike, though. That's awesome. He wants to organize a general strike, but I don't know that he is actually organizing a general strike. He's trying to get people to work together with him to organize a general strike. But the one who's been trying to organize a general strike for some time now, is Arakel Blas. Steve Day says, Jayapal's transition is faster than Bernie's. And Evelina Ponce says, well-funded national health, that is one way because it didn't help Britain much, judging from their COVID numbers. Well, Britain has had a different situation than we with respect to the COVID numbers. It may not have helped them very much with respect to fatalities, but it may have helped them very, very much with respect to the financial stress that people were under, and are under as a result of COVID. At least they don't have to worry about the financial end, and that is very, very important. Lana says, ongoing PO'd. And Evelina says, hey, not way. Or make hay. That is... Sorry, Evelina, I don't get it. Kay says, Cleveland Akron is District 11 in Ohio. Yes, that's what I thought. Evelina said, say. Evelina says, say. Susan says, that is just another handout to the insurance companies. Yes, COBRA is. And Susan says, that's how they keep us suppressed. Oppressed, yes, oppressed it is. Catherine Tokarska says, some see anything government does as a handout, and that they think destroys the country. That's what they say they think. Yes, I think a lot of them are lying. Yes, but it's temporary. And until we get hashtag Medicare for all, a lot of people going to have some much needed help with that COBRA funding. I hate COBRA, for the record. Yeah, so do we all. Medicare for all should be linked to democracy. Indeed, Evelina. Catherine says that's partly why those Republicans stay in power. Evelina says that argument is getting tired. What is government for if not to provide basic rights and work for the public good? Yes. Ghost Start says, oops, I'm late. Hey, Steve, how are you? Susan Solis says, I hear you, but it pisses me off that they still didn't give us Medicare for all. Not surprised, though. Of course. I mean, I was sure Biden was going to do a giveaway for the insurance companies. After all, that's what they pay him for. Evelina says 4. Terry says, sorry for misspelling your name earlier. Kay says that idea came from Reagan in 1980. Catherine said, Terry Burke, not relevant, haha. I answer to either slave name, haha. Terry Burke says, no nukes. Evelina says, Iran poised to buy 100,000 doses, okay, of Cuban vaccine. I read. But do you know when the Cuban vaccine is going to be available? Also, they, of course, not only need 100,000 doses, they need more like 100 million doses. 80 million people in that country. I think it's actually 83 million people or 84 million people. Terry Burke says Trump fired Mad Dog because Mad Dog wouldn't go along with the nuke Iran plan under Trump, because Mad Dog basically said Iran was complying, and the orange fascist fired him. Yeah, Mad Dog Mattis, you mean. Susan Soleil says, we always need to be the victim, though. Remember, we've got to keep up our image. Kay says, the Vietnam War were my days of protests. Evelina says, not just Iran, U.S. warships in the China Sea have not gone unnoticed by the Asian giant. These provocations make me nervous. Me too. And Steve Day says, TY, I went. Terry Burke says, how is Biden going to stand up to warmongers when he already bombed Syria? I don't know. He has, during his career at various times, though, stood up to warmongers. Now, he was doing this in an advisory capacity, and they ignored his advice, of course. But still, he did that from time to time. Catherine says Biden will not do that. Agreed. He is part of the problem, but not a solution. Generally speaking, I think he is part of the problem. Okay, but I also think at this point, he doesn't want another war. I think he will back off as opposed to having one. Kay says, L. Stephen Day to Vietnam. L. Stephen Day says, arms dealers dominate on economic allocation decisions worldwide. Stephen Day, Kay says, sorry to hear about that. And Kay says, back then we finally did the 18-year-old right to vote. Evelina says, didn't much like a Mad Dog, your Latin America basically bullying nations came to Argentina too. Yeah, the Trump administration was bullying everybody in Latin America. Evelina says, toured. Steve Day says, that's okay. I like you spell in 2 words. Susan says, that figure assumed the minimum wage bill would be passed. So that's not accurate info now. Evelina says Mantis. Okay, I think it's Mattis. Who is this Mad Dog? Mad Dog Mattis. says Kay. Terry Burke says, the war hawks are going to start war and tell folks if they go fight and die, their student debt will be erased. Probably that's the way they do it. Susan says, running into the grocery store, TTFN. Not sure what TTFN is. Kay says poverty is the new draft. And Terry says, what is the infrastructure bill for? It's for roads and bridges. It's for houses. It's for the transition to green. I think it's going to have help, for electric vehicles in it, in the transition to electric vehicles. Yeah, it's going to be for rural health clinics also. The case is affordable housing. Joe Manchin said he would support a $4 trillion infrastructure bill over 4 years. There's going to be a lot of green in that. Terry Burke says, Steve Day, then they need to grant free college so nurses and other healthcare-related personnel need to be trained with the quickness. Evelina says, the reptilians is right, laugh out loud. Terry Burke says, read yesterday, Prince Charles is directly related to Vlad the Impaler. That's not going to help us in fighting QAnon. Directly related to Vlad the Impaler. That's fantastic. Evelina says affordable housing is so vital. Steve Zay said nearest clinic, 25 miles advertised, hiring injection giver. Help today on our Facebook community page. Wow, 25 miles. Kay says, Evelina Pont, yes, it is not corporate owned either, Catherine says. I wonder how many people in Queens make the federal minimum wage. I have no idea. Steve Day says, I want the universal ranked choice voting to bust up the two-party potty. So do I. Terry says, the term neoliberalism wasn't around in the times of Zinn, and MLK, I presume. Not in the later time of Zinn, but it wasn't around in the 1960s, or was not actually very well known. In the 1960s. It was around, though, certainly from the 1980s on, and probably from the mid-1970s on. It was around starting with probably starting in the 60s even with, well, I don't know. Certainly wasn't widely known during the 60s. But Friedman was very active in the 60s. And there were being people who agreed with him, people from the society, they were known, as neoliberals to themselves, and some people were calling them that even back in the 1960s. Steve Day says, Phineas T. Filibuster is old howdy doody. Evelina says, not sure PR wants statehood, Dr. Joe. They may not want it, and they'll have to decide. Deborah says, well, gee, Joe, you've hit the nail on the head. Who would not want a reconciliation? And Deborah Wilson said, the filibuster, ending of. Deborah Wilson says, it's all kabuki theater. We're trying to end the kabuki theater, I think. Where am I? And Steve Day says 2 more reconciliations to come, and 4 if Dems do it well in the 117th Congress. L. Stephen Day says, okay, a bill at a time, bill after bill, not. Terry Burke says, those Democrats that want to keep the filibuster as an excuse for their lack of advocacy of the people while slyly being for corporations and industries, they plan to keep the filibuster as a scapegoat. If they can, we have to make it really hot for them. So they cannot do that. Terry Burke says, I must have read the article about Andy Bashir. I do have some learning disability. Yes, it's Bashir. Trump would have won if he canceled student loan debt. Yeah, that too. He would have won if we had done any number of things. I mean, it was very close. It was very close. There were a dozen good things he could have done to have swung the election. Terry Burke said, what a pretty word, succinct. Lana says, who gets taxed with the offset? But did you already go over that? No, I did not. But the offset taxes, okay, are against they've actually been set against extremely well-off people, which is interesting. Kay says, none in my bank account yet, and laugh out loud. Terry says, I know people that have gotten it already, the $1,400, if you have banking, okay, of any sort. Yeah, it's possible that it has arrived in accounts. I checked mine this morning, though. It hasn't arrived in mine yet. Evelyn says, but Yellen got on it very fast, but didn't she? I think she was ready. Lana says, Dr. Joe, did you see the video AOC did but to go over what was in the bill? One beef of mine with the squad is not enough communication, so I was happy she did it. But so many nasty comments in response. No, I did not see that particular video. Terry Burke says, but Ron Wyden is on it. Well, the people who are sending it out, of course, are Treasury. So Catherine says, how are the creditors going to get their hands on the $1,400? Terry Burke says, garnishment, right? Steve Day says, party jumper. And Catherine Tokarska says, are you mean to ban the levies? Yeah, the levies to exempt the stimulus payment from the levies that are in place. Yes. Evelina says, ESO needs Republicans when you've Boy Dems the life of, okay, I think it's Manchin and Cinema, but I think Evelina is having trouble with her keyboard. Catherine Tokarska says, the bank levies. Terry Burke says, I think so. And Evelyn says, come again, laugh out loud. Who needs Republicans when you have Cinema and Manchin? Okay. Well, to make Cinema and Manchin effective, you have to have solid Republicans who are saying no. If the Republicans were not solidly saying no, if there were some Republicans who still acted for the people on occasion, as there were during the 1950s and 1960s, and even parts of the 1970s, maybe even parts of the 1980s, you would have gotten some Republicans to vote for the relief bill in the Senate. It's just incredible that not one voted for the relief bill. I mean, it's just evil that not one of them voted for this relief bill. There were so many things in the relief bill that were similar things they voted for under Trump, and which Democrats voted for under Trump. Kay said, thankfully, I'm debt-free for the first time in many years. Terry says, I'm striking fascist book on April 1st to April 8th just because I'm sick of their shit. Sorry, Dr. F, I won't be on here. I hope that more will join me. Well, you don't have to be on Facebook for me to see you. I can see you on YouTube. That works just fine. Terry says, here. And Terry says, AmeriCorps is still around, Dr. F. Yep, I think AmeriCorps is still around. Evelina says, but Biden didn't only bomb Syria. He also bombed Iraq and Somalia in the first month. Yeah, and also Yemen, or at least he supported the Saudis bombing Yemen. And Terry Burke says, I did, forgot. Joe Manchin said he would support my late grandma, might have replied, quote, that's mighty white of you, unquote. Terry Burke said, sorry. Terry Burke said, good thing Trump was dumb. Kay says, I heard a couple of people on Hill TV who wrote a book called Lucky about Biden's presidency win. Yeah, it's Jonathan Allen, Jonathan Allen, okay, and Amy Parnes are the author, okay, of Lucky. The authors, okay, of Lucky. They were on the Rising show, I believe, this morning, okay, or yesterday morning. I saw the interview with them. It's evidently a very revealing book. And Dolores says, my stimulus check showed up on Friday afternoon as pending for March the 17th. Oh, so you actually have the check, but it won't be depositable until March the 17th. Terry said, yes, my friends did too. That is really amazing. And it just shows that Biden could have had that check out in a few days in January, if when he came into the presidency and those two senators came into the Senate, if they had immediately voted for a rules package that did not have the filibuster in it, that got rid of Rule 22, that would have stopped everything. Then they could have passed a checks bill in the first few days of the administration. The stimulus checks would have been out by January 31st. They could have had them out in just a few days. Terry says, uh-oh, Dolores, they might take your money. I don't know about that, folks. But I have caught up to your comments. Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I love these. I love you all too. And we love you, Kay. Thank you all for coming. And thanks for staying. Thanks for the conversation. Hope you liked things tonight. I know I had a lot of fun. And I will see you on Tuesday if I'm not able to get in some short takes. And Dolores says, thank you and good night all. Lana says, good night. Good night, Lana. And thank you.